What's next for U.S.-China trade negotiations?
I think we can have a relationship where we still get along pretty well with China and really depend on each other a great deal economically, but it's going to be a more contentious relationship.
Made in China 2025. Will it work?
It's very expansionary in nature. It's an intent to create a, I think, British imperialist sort of system where the rest of the world is a resource colony for the Chinese manufacturing base.
Kim Jong-un met Xi Jinping again. Why?
But I think the Chinese economic pressure is the main reason why he's shown more interest in diplomacy.
Welcome to Zooming In. I'm Simone Gao. The first round of trade negotiations between the U.S. and China weren't overly successful. Many of the U.S. demands hit straight at the core of Chinese President Xi Jinping's strategy for Made in China 2025. Can two countries with fundamentally different ideologies come to a trade compromise? How do China's subsidies compare with those in the rest of the world? And how will recent events with Iran and North Korea affect the second round of trade negotiations between the U.S. and China? We'll discuss all these questions and more in this episode of Zooming In.
Trade representatives from the U.S. and China met for the first round of trade talks. Afterwards, the American negotiating team went straight to the airport without releasing a statement, signaling it wasn't a success. According to a May 4th article in the New York Times, the U.S. made several demands, including cutting China's trade surplus by $200 billion by the end of 2020, halting all advanced manufacturing subsidies in its Made in China 2025 program, strengthening protection against intellectual property theft, cutting its tariffs to 3.5% on all non-critical sectors, the same rate as the U.S., and opening its agricultural sectors and services to full U.S. competition. The U.S. seeks fair trade and competition with China, especially in the technology sector. But China is unlikely to make concessions in this area because it is Chinese President Xi Jinping's core strategy for advancing China's competitive advantage.
At the core of the trade war negotiation is Made in China 2025. It's a program that Xi Jinping put in place to structurally convert China from being the world factory to the world leader in high-tech industries. Didn't the U.S. gain its world dominance after the U.K. yielded its position as the center of the world stage? What is the fear this time around? Let's hear my discussion with Assistant Professor of Clinical Entrepreneurship from University of Southern California and co-author of Death by China, Dr. Greg Autry. Some say Made in China 2025 doesn't only seem to be a plan to grow the Chinese economy or making structural changes, it is expansionary in nature. Do you agree?
Oh, absolutely. It's very expansionary in nature. It's an intent to create a, I think, British imperialist sort of system where the rest of the world is a resource colony for the Chinese manufacturing base, and that the wealth of the Chinese people and the geopolitical power of the Chinese government accelerates. Other countries will produce things like soybeans and send them to China, but not be allowed to produce things like manufactured goods or high-tech materials, which will be the sole province of the Chinese government. And that, I think, should worry us all.
Right. Since joining the WTO in 2001, what has China's trade strategy been?
I think their fundamental strategy has been to target one strategic industry after another, and they've been very clear. Often these are explicitly called out in their 5-year plans. And they go after that industry by subsidizing the manufacturing, very often with state-owned enterprises funded by state-owned banks. Then they lure in a great deal of Western capital to help them execute on that plan with promises of high returns. And they use that to produce massive overcapacity in that particular field, whether that's steel or solar modules. This drives the price of the global commodity down to the point that American and European, Japanese companies can no longer afford to reinvest in their manufacturing facilities and keep themselves current, and they lose their competitive advantage. And this has worked brilliantly for the Chinese. So they end up capturing a monopoly stand in that category, and then they can begin to raise prices in order to bring the profits back to China while their competitors are out of the market.
And why is this unfair?
Well, I don't know it makes a difference whether it's unfair or not. It's certainly not in the interest of the Western countries to lose these industries. I believe it's not in the interest of the global human race for the Chinese Communist Party to hold that much economic power, because that supports their political and military power, which is certainly a problem for China's neighbors immediately, and I believe for the rest of the world going forward. So I don't really worry about issues of fairness as much as I worry about what are the actual long-term outcomes of this. Plus, again, China's companies, particularly state-owned enterprises, focus on driving the manufacturing costs down and the volumes up, and they don't focus on fundamental innovation and development. And this is the sort of thing that will undermine the long-term benefits to everybody on Earth that come from the amazing innovation that happens in places like California, Silicon Valley.
Right. This idea of free market, free trade, and fair competition is a manifestation of human freedom and dignity. However, the Chinese communist regime does not hold the same values. So if these are the driving forces behind the US-China trade conflict and many other conflicts, can policy amendments or changes on the policy level alone really solve all these problems?
I don't know whether they can solve these problems, but we have no choice but to take policy changes and try to aggressively protect the investments that we've made in technologies and industries that produce jobs and wealth for Americans, and ensure that those technologies are not simply transported, and even worse, capitalized with American capital investment to become competing institutions in a country whose ideology is opposed to the things that made all that possible. It's ironic that the Communist Party has learned to use this tool of bourgeois capitalism. If you read the Communist Manifesto, Marx is very clear at the beginning about the power of the entrepreneurial class to create wealth and capital for a nation to go forward. And I think that the Chinese are very clear about the importance of leveraging that as a tool in the first step of their agenda. But in the long run, I don't think they're committed to these ideals, and they simply are using them to get to the power base that they need to execute on what they want to do after that, which in my mind is pretty horrific.
Coming up, Made in China 2025. Will it work? According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Made in China 2025 is a program to comprehensively upgrade Chinese industry. Its goal is to raise China's domestic production of core components to 40% by 2020 and 70% by 2025. The Chinese regime relies on financial subsidies to keep costs down and compete in domestic and international markets. According to China commentator Wen Zhao, the regime uses public financial resources and taxpayers' money to subsidize individual companies and industries. So it's not the product that's competitive, but the institution behind it. One example of this is BOE Technology Group Company, which produces liquid crystal panels in China. The company received government subsidies for scientific research and products. In 2017, it borrowed an export tax rebate and increased its profits by 6 billion yuan. This gave BOE an advantage in domestic and international markets and impacted the industry in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. While the Chinese government encourages its own companies to compete internationally, it restricts foreign companies from setting up factories in China to compete in the Chinese market. A typical example is the car industry. Some say the rise of South Korean science and technology also relied on government subsidies. But those subsidies come at a much smaller scale and function in a more limited way compared to the ones from the Chinese government. This nationwide system is unique to China because it can intervene in society in ways that other countries can't. Other countries have private banks and independent regulatory authorities that won't take unnecessary risks. But China can tell its state-controlled banks to provide loans that private banks wouldn't. The Chinese government also directly invests in scientific research. Although other countries do this as well, China's scale is much larger.
The West has long struggled with the too big to fail phenomenon. When certain corporations, particularly financial institutions, are so large and so interconnected that their failure would be disastrous to the greater economic system, they must be supported by government when they face potential failure. Every country does this to a certain extent. The difference is the West uses the government as a safe net, but the Chinese communist regime uses the government as a competitive advantage. How will this conflict unfold moving forward? Let's hear my discussion with Brookings Institute Senior Fellow Michael O'Hanlon. Among the U.S. demands in the trade negotiations last week, there is halting all advanced manufacturing subsidies in its Made in China 2025 program. China turned down that request because for Xi Jinping, this is at core of his strategy for China to gain competitive advantage over other countries in the next couple of decades. So, how do you foresee this conflict unfolding going forward?
Well, of course, in the classic sense, most free market economies don't believe in direct subsidization of industry because they don't want to give unfair trade advantage. But I think that's a better argument when you're talking about established sectors like aerospace, and we already have the technology. It's just a question of producing it at a optimal cost. On this kind of an issue, I have some sympathy for the Chinese position because they're trying to push forward on important areas of technology. And yes, those are important for China's competitive position vis-a-vis other countries, but they're also important for the well-being of humanity. And I don't think it's a bad thing for countries to be trying to spur along a certain amount of technological innovation. We certainly have various kinds of scientific research efforts in the United States that are partially supported by the federal government at a core level of basic research, or even in some cases more advanced technology demonstration and prototyping. And therefore, I think it's a legitimate question about how much China and where China should invest in areas like artificial intelligence. If it starts trying to give competitive advantage to its own firms as they try to market certain products and then subsidizes the development and sale of those products, that becomes closer to a trade violation according to the normal rules of the WTO. But for basic innovation, basic technology research, I think that that's a whole different category of discussion, and the United States needs to recognize that. I'm not suggesting this is a slam dunk case that should not be discussed at all. But there is a major distinction between trying to promote technology innovation on the one hand, which I think is generally legitimate, and then trying to help specific products be sold at perhaps lower than their proper production costs, which is not legitimate.
I think a more accurate description is that the Chinese government actually does it all. Yes, they gave subsidies to technology innovation, but they also help Chinese products to be sold at a lower price. On top of that, they are directly involved in using government-funded operations to steal foreign technology. The following discussion I had with Mr. O'Hanlon addresses the changes in the U.S. attitudes towards China. Let's take a listen. Over the past decades, the Chinese economy thrived on relying on Western investment and technology sharing. In exchange, the West was eyeing the enormous Chinese consumer market. At what point was this understanding disrupted, and what were the driving factors?
It's an excellent question. I think there are a lot of reasons why not just because of President Trump, but more generally in the United States, the tide has shifted in how we think about China as an economic partner. It's true that for many years after, especially the ascent of Deng Xiaoping, the United States and other Western countries tried to engage with China economically and tolerated even some intellectual property theft and other kinds of bending of the rules or breaking of the rules of international trade. And part of the hope here was that a more prosperous China would gradually become more of a partner with the outside world in economics and also in security, and that China would liberalize partly as it became richer. And that was part of the gamble. And then, as you say, also the United States and many Western countries, their companies wanted to get into that Chinese consumer market. And so we wanted to cooperate for that reason as well. We assumed that China would build a better system of law and a more favorable investment climate and environment. And over time, this would continue to improve. Well, now over the last 10 years or so, we've really seen a number of important developments that have begun to erode this framework, this paradigm. For one thing, of course, China's now a potential military threat, and we see assertive behavior in places like the South China Sea and the East China Sea, along with a $200 billion a year military budget, which means that some of this wealth China is using for reasons that could be at our disadvantage. Second, Xi Jinping has consolidated his own control and the strength of the Communist Party, at least in terms of central policy making. So the idea that wealth or a wealthier China would become a freer China or a more democratic China has been proven to be wrong. And then finally, the last thing I would say is that, of course, now we also have unfair trade practices in China that are really not getting better as time goes by. And the Western world is going to have to protect its own intellectual property and its own market access a little more. So in this regard, we should not view Donald Trump as a particular outlier in terms of American politics. And yes, I think that Democrats and Republicans will increasingly be united in trying to push back against China in certain areas. I think we can have a relationship where we still get along pretty well with China and really depend on each other a great deal economically, but it's going to be a more contentious relationship, and the United States is going to seek out to protect certain prerogatives more than it has for most of the post-Mao era.
Coming up, how will recent events in North Korea and Iran affect U.S.-China trade negotiations? North Korean leader Kim Jong-un held talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping and other senior Chinese officials on May 7th and 8th. It was the second trip in the past 2 months, coming in advance of Kim's talks with President Trump.
My fellow Americans, today I want to update the world on our efforts to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon.
On May 8th, President Trump announced his withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal. And Chinese Vice Premier Liu He will come to Washington for round 2 of trade talks.
Kim Jong-un surprised the world once again by meeting Xi Jinping on May 8th. That was the second visit in 2 months and right before the Trump-Kim meeting. Is China trying to leverage North Korea as a negotiation chip for its trade issues? What message is Trump sending by announcing the U.S. withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal? Here's what our guests had to say. What do Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping want to get out of their recent meeting?
Obviously, North Korea needs to lighten the economic pressure that it's faced ever since its nuclear and missile tests of 2017, and the Chinese willingness to really put more pressure on North Korea economically than had ever been the case before. I think this is the simplest explanation for Kim Jong-un's charm offensive. There are other explanations that contribute perhaps as well, such as the fact that now he has a more elaborate nuclear weapons capability, and maybe he feels more confident in that capability, and he's also perhaps afraid a little bit of President Trump's threats. But I think the Chinese economic pressure is the main reason why he's shown more interest in diplomacy. So now I think he's trying to establish good rapport with various countries that he had been neglecting or ignoring or been bellicose towards. And with China in particular, he obviously hopes that even without necessarily making all the concessions that Washington will demand, even without complete denuclearization in the immediate future, that there will still be a lessening of Chinese economic pressure. I think he's trying to set the table for that kind of a deal with Washington because he understands that President Trump really wants complete denuclearization to happen very fast. I don't think that's realistic. And the most important thing for President Kim to do in his own calculus is to improve relations with South Korea and China to the point where he will get some economic relief even prior to any complete denuclearization. And so I think that's probably much of the subject matter and also much of the overall purpose of these meetings. For the Chinese, they want a stable situation on the Korean Peninsula. They would like to see these talks be successful. I certainly hope they're telling President Kim that Washington does mean business. And even if there could be a phased approach towards denuclearization, it's going to have to be a serious process, and it's going to have to begin with some significant North Korean steps, like dismantling the nuclear weapons production infrastructure that has led to a growing arsenal in recent years. So those are some of the messages and purposes that I expect led to the Kim-Xi summits in recent weeks.
How will President Trump's exit from the Iran deal affect his upcoming talks with Kim Jong-un?
Well, I would expect that North Korea would have two main observations about the Iran nuclear deal. One of them is that it's for a problem a long ways away, a country a long ways away, a much different situation, especially because Iran has been aggressive throughout the broader Middle East, and that's something that threatens American interests and American allies in a way that North Korea, for all of its main and big problems, does not threaten the United States the same way regionally. It is not actively stoking terrorism or violence in other countries the way that Iran is. So the first observation that I believe Kim would have is that Iran is a long ways away and a different problem. But the second observation would be that perhaps he can use Iran as a bit of bargaining leverage. And he can say to President Trump, do you really think I can give up my nuclear arsenal entirely and immediately in a situation where I have reason to doubt that a future American president would respect the deal that you're now willing to make with me? And maybe even if you promise never to threaten military force against North Korea, maybe a future president would change his or her mind the same way that you, President Trump, changed the American position on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran. And in other words, Kim would use that as a talking point and as a bargaining point of leverage in trying to point out to President Trump why complete and immediate denuclearization is really not realistic for North Korea. I hope that North Korea will completely denuclearize very fast, but I do not expect it. And I think Kim will be looking for ways to reduce the likelihood that he'll be put under a lot of pressure to achieve that complete and immediate denuclearization.
Will it also affect U.S.-China trade negotiations?
Well, when I was in Beijing this week, we had numerous Track 2 discussions with some very prominent Chinese scholars at various think tanks. And a number of them said to us, the American delegation from Brookings and other think tanks, they said that we don't really think these issues need to be linked, but all of us also acknowledged, or many of us acknowledged, that sometimes these issues are linked because the way in which leaders get along, the basic atmospherics of their relationship, can affect their ability to address a problem like North Korea. So even if we say that North Korea should be viewed on its own terms, it definitely tends to have some impact, just what happens in other sectors, like on issues of Taiwan, issues of trade, and so forth. So there's a partial separation of the topics, but there will not be complete delinkage. I don't think that's realistic.
Here's what Greg Autry has to say about this topic. Kim Jong-un visited China for the second time last week. What do Kim and Xi want, respectively?
I wish I knew. I wish I could be a fly in that room and see what that conversation is about. In my personal opinion, the Chinese government has always used the North Korean government as a tool to off-put the United States geopolitically and militarily. Very often when the Chinese Communist Party needed a distraction from a tense U.S.-China issue, they would, I believe, provoke one of the Kims to move forward and create a situation that required the United States to then go supplicate to Beijing and ask for assistance in managing the Kim regime. So I will sit back and watch with great interest. As far as what Xi and Kim said, I suspect that Xi told Kim what to do, but who knows?
How will President Trump's exit from the Iran deal affect his upcoming talks with Kim Jong-un?
I think it underscores the fact that we're suddenly dealing with a U.S. president who isn't a lapdog to global perceptions of how geopolitics should be managed, but actually stands up for U.S. interests in a bold and straightforward way. The willingness to exit out of a badly conceived previous agreement, I think, makes it clear to Kim that he's dealing with somebody who will act forcefully in U.S. interests.
We've seen a lot of firsts with how the Trump administration handles geopolitics. The withdrawal from the Iran nuclear agreement and the upcoming talks with Kim Jong-un are a big contrast from previous administrations. And with the next round of trade talks between the US and China, it remains to be seen whether or not a compromise can be made, and if two opposing ideologies can actually come to an agreement. Thanks for watching Zooming In. I'm Simone Gao, and see you next week.